Great explanation from Luther on Martin Luther and the general Protestant Reformation. That's very important in the political climate of Europe. And of course, the political climate and the religious climate at this time period is essentially the same. And Luther did a good job at explaining those concepts as well. But while he went over Martin Luther's life, I'm going to do more of a zoom out and why it makes sense for European powers to do something as risky as building little wooden forts on the edge of a continent they barely understand with a bunch of savages trying to kill them. So just to keep it tight, I'm going to try to frame it around 5 big ideas. The first is that Spain and Portugal are acting like the Atlantic world already belongs to them. Right after Columbus, you get this mindset that the non-European world can be claimed under divine and legal authority. In 1493, the Pope issues a papal bull called Inter Caetera, which basically grants Spain a right to claim and evangelize newly found Western lands. Then Spain and Portugal make it concrete with the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, which draws a line down the map that essentially says west of this line is Spain's zone and east of this line is Portugal's zone. And then that kind of lines up with modern day Brazil and the rest of Latin America, not exactly. But in their minds, in the minds of a lot of European elites, the world outside of Europe is basically divided between 2 crowns. And that matters because the English and the Dutch are late entrants. And when they're looking across the Atlantic, they're looking on a globe that's already carved up by the Spanish and the Portuguese. Now, the second big idea, and this is massive, and Eric already went over it before, and another host, is that it's the printing press. This changes the entire game of Europe. When Gutenberg's printing technology spreads across Europe, it doesn't just produce more books, it produces a new kind of society, one where ideas can move fast and widely and cheaply. And the single most explosive consequence, especially for religion, which is the same as politics this time, is that the Bible goes from being mostly mediated through clergy to being physically accessible by individuals. So more and more through vernacular translations and printed copies that can circulate beyond monasteries and universities. And not everyone can read, and books cost money, but even with those limits, the printing press does 2 things that matter for our story. It puts scripture into broader circulation, and it creates an early mass media political battlefield. Because the printing press creates kind of pamphlet warfare, not just theology, but propaganda. And to think about what that means politically, rulers and reformers, they can now shape public opinion. And rival states can amplify scandal materials. They can give atrocity propaganda, sermons, and manifestos. So the printing press doesn't just help Protestantism and the Protestant Reformation, it creates an entire ecosystem where religious conflict spreads faster, political allegiance becomes tied to religious identity, and Europe becomes a continent where ideas can ignite entire religions. And once Europe becomes an information war, the Atlantic becomes another theater for that information war. Now, the third big idea is that anti-Spanish politics, which later historians called the Black Legend, once Europe fractures along those religious lines, Spain isn't just the richest imperial power, it's also the chief Catholic enforcer in the Protestant eyes. And that's where the printing culture matters, because texts can be translated and mass-produced and circulated as political weapons. And 2 kinds of sources can get weaponized. On one hand, you have the Spanish legal religious conquest logic, things like the Requerimiento, a declaration that essentially tells native people, we come under the authority of the Pope and the Spanish crown, submit, we're justified in making war because of that. And then you have the Bartolomé de las Casas, who was a Spanish friar, who writes a moral critique on Spanish royalty, and he attacks abuses from inside the Spanish world. And Spain's rivals love this in the Protestant world because it's ammunition for them. So Protestants in Northern Europe can translate and circulate his materials and build an image of Spain as a tyrant and bloodthirsty in its imperial model. Now, why that's useful is because that allows the English and the Dutch, our ancestors, to pitch their own Atlantic actions as morally justified. So the Black Legend becomes political PR and a moral story that helps justify Spain's monopoly, why Spain's monopoly should be broken. A fourth big idea is the Dutch Revolt and a new kind of Protestant statecraft. In the late 1500s, the Netherlands, under the Habsburg Empire, under Philip II of Spain, over the course of the 80 Years' War, the Dutch staged a long, grinding, successful revolt. And their case is very influential because of three reasons. Number one is explicitly religious and political, because many of the Dutch provinces are Reformed and Calvinist, and I'm going to explain Calvinism in the religious section later. Second is that they put radical ideas into writing. So you get the Union of Utrecht, which binds provinces together. And you have the Act of Abjuration, which basically is a formal statement that a ruler who behaves like a tyrant can be lawfully rejected, which goes into our own American history later on. And the third idea is that they become a commercial sea power. The Dutch don't just rebel and survive, they become a trading powerhouse. They build companies and fleets with global reach. So England is just watching a living example right across the channel, a Protestant commercial state that is seafaring, that defies Spain, and that gives England a model of how to combine religion, trade, and naval power as a justification to plant these new colonies. Now, my fifth and final idea, there's France's instability in the same period. Because from 1562 to 1598, France is torn up by the French wars of religion, like is going on in Germany with Martin Luther, which Luther went over before. But this is Catholics against the Huguenots, and the Huguenots are not named after John Calvin like the Calvinists are. In fact, there's no Calvinist branch. I'll go over Calvinism later, but with the Huguenots, who are Calvinists, not Lutheran, you get civil war, shifting alliances, and atrocities like the St. Bartholomew Day massacre. But for our purposes, two things basically matter. If you want Exhibit A for Europe as a pressure cooker, it's France, because it's a major kingdom that's shredding itself over religion and legitimacy. The other thing is that it's a kingdom busy trying not to collapse at home. It's going to project consistent power abroad, and that creates opportunity, and that gives more space in the Atlantic for the English and the Dutch to maneuver. And even after the Edict of Nantes in 1598, France's settlement is fragile. It's not a permanent cure. So heading into 1607, you have a Europe where Spain is dominant and claims the Atlantic. You have Northern Protestants who are morally and politically mobilized against the Spanish Catholic Empire. The Dutch demonstrate successful maritime resistance. France is unstable, and the printing press is accelerating every conflict by turning ideas into fast-moving weapons. In closing, I'm going to hand it off to Jim, who's going to go over the pre-Westphalian order and explain that.
Yeah, and I can kind of zoom out in the interest of time and look at it more so from 30,000 feet. So you're going to hear very commonly a distinction of the state before and after the Peace of Westphalia. If this is something that interests you, listen to or read William Lind. Eric recently had a very nice discussion with Mike from Imperium Press. I've done some work on it. It's in my pinned tweet. But essentially, the Peace of Westphalia is a nice, clean marking point to denote the transition from more decentralized power, decentralized statehood, people giving their primary allegiance not to the state, but to other organizations, whether it be religious, political, criminal, so on and so forth. And post-Westphalia, they start to consolidate power into a centralized bureaucracy, centralized state. And what ends up happening is we come to the present day where the state has a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. While that is a clean mark, that doesn't mean that somebody waved a magic wand and the whole order changed overnight as a result of this treaty. As with everything, there's an ebb and flow. They blend into each other, mix and mingle. But we can broadly say that the why behind colonization that we'll eventually see in the New World is linked to the tumultuous state of early modern Europe. This will culminate in the era defined by the 30 Years' War that ends in the Peace of Westphalia. It creates this fundamental shift in the logic of statecraft. So Pre-Westphalia, Europe we have to understand as we're starting to talk about colonization, that Europe is a patchwork of weak, decentralized polities where political legitimacy is deeply entwined with religious confession and dynastic right. We've mentioned the Peace of Augsburg and the principle of his realm, his religion. We can talk a little bit about Calvinism and persistent dynastic conflicts that erupted or caused the 30 Years' War to erupt. But you just have to understand from the context of people who lived at this period of time just how impactful these wars of religion were, just how devastating they were, to the point where I truly believe that this left a genetic imprint on our people. Roughly 20 to 30%. By the end of this, by the time Westphalia is signed, an estimated 20 to 30% of the Holy Roman Empire is dead. There's localized devastation of up to 50%. There's a fundamental crisis of political and religious authority that served as a profound demographic and psychological selection event for European society. Pre-Westphalia, we see motives for exploration of the New World being monarchs who are deriving their legitimacy from God and the papacy or divine right. Saw overseas expansion as an extension of the continent-wide religious struggle at the time. Colonies are outposts for the conversion of native populations and strategic moves against rival confessions. On an individual level, why might an individual pre-Westphalia look to go to the New World? Well, religious persecution and endemic violence is a powerful push factor. Again, conceptualize how devastating 50% depopulation in a certain region would be. If we had a singular battle in this day and age that resulted in 10% casualties, it would be looked on as a bloodbath, not to say anything of population displacement. And currently, there's economic pressures that we will see, particularly in England, like primogeniture. Primogeniture being the transition of family wealth to the firstborn son, particularly land. Given the land scarcity in England, that's going to be a powerful push factor pre-Westphalia as well, and post-Westphalia. After the Peace of Westphalia, it sort of enshrines the modern principle of state sovereignty and legal equality among the states. Conflicts start to get a lot more secular. Right around this time is where you see interesting things happening, like Protestant states going to war with one another, or, Catholics aligning with Muslim Ottomans to go to war with other Catholics. That happened right in this period of time, in the transition period. But the shift to state sovereignty has a profound impact on colonial rationale. State motives now transition away from a religious undertaking to a tool of secular state policy, projection of power, mercantilist competition. So at this point in time, we also have to understand, which we'll touch on in the economics section, that state power is directly linked to the amount of hard cash assets you have on hand, particularly gold and silver. Territory becomes a strategic asset. Raw materials are now a strategic asset, which constitute national wealth. Individually, religious freedom still remains a factor, particularly for sects like the Quakers. But the predominant pull will start to become economic opportunity. And we'll see this in some of the early failures of colonization of the New World as well in North America. This becomes institutionalized through systems like indentured servitude, which grant the poor the ability to have their passage paid for in exchange for a certain number of years of labor for the transatlantic passage. Religion is increasingly subordinated to the state. Alliances now blatantly cross confessional lines. We talked a little bit more about that. And I think that sums up the